As Yvonne alluded to, we've been interested in this question of sow housing for quite a while. I think for me, one of the challenges that I face is trying to tell you something new and something different. And I guess what I want to try to do today is develop this concept that I've labeled pig's eye view of animal welfare. And really, there's a lot of voices in this discussion about sow housing, and what I want to put forward today is my perspective that I think maybe there's somewhat of a forgotten voice in this discussion, and that's the voice of the animal. And I think if I'm actually successful, I may push some of you even out of your comfort zone. So we'll see about thinking about this problem, but we'll see how it goes. So anyways, as Yvonne alluded to, we've been interested in the question for a while. Almost over 15 years ago, we had the chance to build a new teaching and research facility at the veterinary school in Pennsylvania. And at that point, maybe the obvious thing to do was to build a crated barn, because that's where our students would be stepping out to work at that point in the U.S. industry. However, we were aware of what was going on in Europe, and so my dean gave me the challenge to go ahead and see if we could go ahead and construct a facility that really minimize the amount of time that sows would be restrained. And one of the things we adopted was a pen gestation system you see here using electronic sow feeding. I think what was unexpected to me when we did that was that through a series of different steps that we ended up having the opportunity to actually work directly with the industry to help make this transition away from gestation stalls. And you can see to date now we've worked with about 75 farms in the US and Canada. The technology is very portable, anywhere from 100 sows to 10,000 sow farms, and we have about 200,000 sows that are using this model that we prototyped. And really at some level, that's the basis and that I bring from a perspective, and you'll see that in doing this, you actually get out. You may think you know what you're doing until you get out there, and once you do it with 200,000 sows, you start to realize what you don't know. And so some of what I'll share with you at the end is our effort to go back and research some of those questions that were identified through the outreach activity. This is just for the lawyers to keep everybody happy. I do consulting for some companies, but the important part here is that basically what I want to talk to you about today is really based on our experience working through the veterinary school. Okay, so I think the protagonist kind of in the discussion here is going to be the gestation stall. I presume most everybody is familiar with that, but just in case you're not, it's a 2x7 individual animal enclosure. And it was introduced 40 years ago as a welfare tool, because when you had pigs mixed, grouped together, you would get issues related to aggression, as you can see. And so by housing them as individuals, it reduced those aggression problems, and it also allowed us to go forward and improve individual animal care and individual nutrition. So at the time, I think everybody thought it was a good thing. Viewed through today's lens, and certainly Colette alluded to the fact that how views on welfare continued to change, people now see that 2x7 enclosure as raising welfare concerns. So, and the biggest issue that's out there is it precludes the sow's ability to perform certain natural behaviors, such as turning around. And it's gotten, it really has grown in the public discussion. And a couple years ago, it was actually featured not once but twice on the Jon Stewart show. So really has risen to the level of kind of common discussion, at least in the US. So, and I would suggest to you that I think we're on this transition here, moving away from gestation stalls. This is a timeline to kind of lay out what I see as some of the seminal time points, and we go back to 1998 when the European Union banned gestation stalls. They had a essentially 15-year phase-out period, and so that's passed. So when gestation stalls, in theory, are gone from the EU. The first ban on gestation stalls in the U.S. was in Florida in 2001, and then 2006 was Arizona, and 2008 was California. And these were all done through referendums, so populist votes. And I would just suggest that that's been one way through which sow housing has changed through this legislative approach. And but as you can see, most of those states don't have very many sows in them, so it hasn't had that big of an impact. There's now a total of 9 states where gestation stalls are outlawed or going to be phased out, and only 2 of those really remain. Michigan and Ohio really only have significant populations of sows. But from my perspective, what's really actually having a much bigger impact on the industry has been these market-driven initiatives. And so Smithfield stepped out in 2007 and made a commitment to eliminate gestation stalls from their farms, and they're carrying through on that and almost complete with that. And I think the probably bigger step on the market-driven side was when McDonald's in 2012 announced that they were asking their suppliers to go ahead and also eliminate gestation stalls. And again, had given, I think, a 10-year time horizon. And maybe what was unexpected, maybe not, within 2 years, 70 other food companies had jumped on that bandwagon and made a similar commitment. And we could probably talk for a full hour about the challenges of trying to respond to a market-driven change like this. It's different than what is legislative. It's much more clear with the legislative thing, but I'm not going to really delve too much in that, just to suggest that we're definitely on this course of transition in this country being driven really by the market. And I think the other thing I like to point out, if you have questions about where you think the future of sow housing is going in this country, if you look, so this is some graphic from Steve Myers, an economist in the swine industry, and he's basically listed all the large or major slaughter plants in the U.S. So obviously that's the bottleneck from pigs becoming pork. And what you can see today, about 70% of those of the shackle space, so the capacity to slaughter hogs, is controlled by 4 companies. And I think it's interesting to me that all 4 of those companies to different levels own sows, and they have committed to moving their sows out of gestation stalls. So to me, that seems to be a signal that that's where they see the market going, and I expect it to continue on. So that's all well and good. That's the direction that we see sow housing headed. But the dilemma is that there's really no perfect system. And so it turns out that if you look critically at all the different options that are out there, no one of them meets all the welfare needs of the sow. And that's really, again, from a public perspective, that's what's driving it, is they want to improve animal welfare. And so in the face of the fact that you don't have a perfect system, by choosing one system over another, you're kind of de facto prioritizing certain animal welfare needs over others. And so I think, to me, that's a bit of a dilemma. And furthermore, it turns out there's a variety of different solutions. These are probably the 4 most common ways that we see sows housed in gestation in the U.S., and they each have their own strengths and weaknesses from both a production standpoint and from a welfare standpoint. So I think we're at this point where the market has said what it doesn't want. Okay, it says it doesn't want gestation stalls, but it really hasn't committed as to what's an acceptable alternative. And so that's a very difficult situation for producers, because they're being asked to invest money in a fairly uncertain situation. And then the bigger question is, who actually makes this decision if we're going to go forward and try to implement systems that have some compromises? So, what's acceptable, and then actually who's going to make that decision? And, I think at some level, I think the ag community would say maybe that decision should be made by farmers, because they're the ones who are most comfortable and the most familiar with the animals. You could make another argument that maybe it should be veterinarians and animal scientists, because maybe they're trained professionally to think about these, so maybe those are the ones that should be making the decision. But certainly, as it's played out in Arizona, California, and Florida, it's actually the populace, the public, that is actually decided through actually how sows will be housed. And then finally, I don't know how much you guys follow Eastern Coast politics, but a couple years ago, actually in New Jersey, it was one man that made the decision as to how sows would be housed, as Governor Christie actually twice vetoed bills that had come through the legislation to ban gestation stalls in New Jersey. Interesting enough, it's not clear whether there even is a sow in gestation stalls in New Jersey, but that's another discussion for another day about New Jersey politics. But I think you can see the problem here in terms of going forward. How do we identify what to do? And what I'm going to suggest here is that I think, though we've alluded to all these different voices, I think one of the voices that has gotten lost or kind of forgotten would be the pig itself. Okay, so we're trying to move forward and we want to improve the welfare of the pig, and we have all these different options out there, but I think really we almost owe it to the animals, or maybe owe it to the consumers, to actually measure and find out what the pig wants, and is the pig's welfare really improved by these changes, rather than just simply assuming. And I'd say that's kind of where we're at today in many cases. And so this is the tagline, it's a pig's eye view of swine welfare. And so what I'm saying here, asking the question is, can we, with an understanding of sow behavioral needs, impact the success of sow housing? So can, by understanding this problem a little bit better, can we actually go ahead and improve what the market is kind of pushing the industry to do? And so I would suggest that current practices that really have been driven by a couple or three different pressures. So obviously, one is to optimize productivity, two, to try to maximize some economical sustainability so that farmers can stay in business, and then of late, we've had laid on top of this, this need to meet societal expectations. And I'm going to suggest to you that the direction that these pressures have pushed it may not always be in harmony with the behavioral instincts and wants of the animals. And so it's the potential that maybe we're not doing what the consumers want for the animals in the end. So I'd like to take time today to talk about two different approaches to think about this pig's eye view. So, how can we understand better what the sow wants and needs, and what I've dubbed ethological, and so that's a big word for behavior, particularly behavior in a natural setting. And so I think I'm going to suggest that maybe we can learn something by looking at the behavior of pigs in the wild, and I'll build the case for why that might be relevant or important. And then what I want to conclude with is some experimental work that we're doing currently at Penn, where we're really trying to probe and, if you will, ask pigs what they want or need. So, I want to talk first about this ethological approach. And so, when you kind of let pigs do their own thing, particularly if you put them in a more natural or complex setting, you have the opportunity to understand endogenous or instinctual behaviors. And so the opportunities to do that would be with the wild boar, or in some cases we have feral or semi-feral pigs that we can look at and just try to understand what their behavior is, I think, when they have more control over their environment. And so, and I just want to be clear, I'm certainly not advocating that we go back to extensive production systems. There's a niche market out there, and if people want to do that, there's opportunities, but I'm not advocating that that's what we're trying to do with our supply chain here. Just really want to ask the question, we can better understand how domestication has changed pigs. And I think, if you look from a morphology, from a carcass trait perspective, it's very obvious what we've done through domestication. I think also from a productivity or fecundity perspective, you can see that we have pigs that are much more productive than they were when they were in the wild. But I think what we don't have such a good understanding about is, have we been able to kind of modify some of these instinctual or survival behaviors through natural selection? And that's what I want to get us to think a little bit about. And so, and I think you could ask, well, does a wild pig really apply? what's the relevance here? And I think for me, one of the things that makes me stand up here and want to talk about this is this famous experiment called the Edinburgh Pig Park, done by David Woodgosh and his colleagues about 30 years ago. And basically they took domesticated swine and put them back out into a semi-natural environment, what they called the pig park, and observed them. And what they found was that they fairly quickly reverted back to the behaviors that we would have associated with wild swine. So suggesting that at least certain behaviors or the drive to perform these behaviors are still really hardwired in these animals. So what, so let's look a little harder at what some of those things are. And so I would suggest you can see the difference between today's sow and a wild or feral pig, that certainly selective breeding has made an impact. And how long has that been going on? So the records would suggest that we've been domesticating swine for about 9,000 years. You can go back and look at some of the artifacts from different times, whether it's the Greeks or the Romans or Egyptians, and there's evidence of people and pigs kind of cohabitating, and people using pigs for their benefits. But I'd like to point out that if you look, so that would be selective breeding. If you look in the fossil record, what you can see is that there's been a pig-like animal on the face of this earth for almost 50 million years. So for me, the question is, who wins out here when we start to look at what we have today for a pig? Is it the 50 million years of natural selection or the 9,000 years of domestication? And so, and honestly, I've got my money on natural selection just because it's such a much bigger number, right? So, but let's see what we find. So what can we learn if we look at the natural history of pigs? So if you look at pigs in the wild, they're social animals, and so they're structured in what they call sounders. So these are kind of groups of 2 to 4 adult females and immature offspring. They're usually related, so it's a family group. And the sounder size is usually related to the availability of resources. So if there's plentiful resources, that group size is going to get a little bit bigger. If resources get limited, then they're going to split off and go off and try to identify new territory where they can find find additional resources. And I would point out that if we actually look, when we put pigs into pen gestation, you can see that we organize, often putting together these bedrooms to allow them to go ahead and kind of self-aggregate. It's a little bit like high school. They form these cliques, and they tend to sleep in the same space with the same animals, and that animal size is usually kind of in this somewhere between 4 to 8 animals. So it looks like they do retain some of that idea of what's an appropriate social structure. Furthermore, in the wild, there's always a hierarchy that's present within the sounder. It's based on size and age of the animals. It's basically generational. Usually the older animals are the dominant ones, and then when they get weak or die off, then someone moves up and fills that spot in the social hierarchy as the opportunities present. And I think anybody that's worked with pigs in pens know that social hierarchy is a big deal today with pigs. Furthermore, if you look at how pigs spend their day in the wild, they spend about 6 to 8 hours a day foraging. So they're rooting, grazing, exploration. So they're looking for food. And they usually cover a home range that's somewhere around 125 to 250 acres. Again, that's going to depend on resource availability. And then they also have something called social facilitation. And so that means they tend to synchronize their behavior. So when one eats, everybody eats. When one sleeps, everybody sleeps. And so that's just kind of how they tend to organize their life. So I think a couple of striking things that come out of here is the kind of ground, the amount of area that they cover, and so that's a big number, I think. And then this motivation for foraging. So if you think about how we manage sows today, in particular, we're going to feed them maybe once or maybe twice a day, And they're going to be able to consume all the feed they need to meet their nutritional needs in probably somewhere between 15 to 30 minutes. But I believe they're probably programmed to spend most of their waking hours looking for food, okay? And so, and unfortunately we couldn't get the video to run here today, but those of you that have been in some of these pen gestation barns will often see sham chewing. So it looks a lot like a cow chewing its cud. And I think part of that interpretation is that's that motivational drive to forage. I mean, their pigs experience the world through their mouth. If you've ever been in a pig pen, it's not going to take very long before they're chewing on your foot, right? And so that's how they, as they are kind of wired to spend most of the day rooting through sticks and rocks, hoping to find that nut. And so I think, I think we see that evidence of that foraging behavior, or that drive to forage, still today in our sows. Then finally, the thing I wanted to talk about, aggression, because I think that's one of the biggest things we worry about when we deal with pen gestation. And it turns out it's actually rare in the wild, because their preferred method of dealing with these kind of conflicts is avoidance. And I think it's clear when you've got a 250-acre home range that if you really don't want to mess with someone, you probably can find a way to get away from them, right? And so at some level, when we go ahead and put pigs in pens and confine the space to, to anywhere from tens to hundreds of square feet, that's going to escalate this point of aggression. So one of the things we've looked at, and this is work that was done by one of my colleagues, Dr. Megan Pearden, working in our group, is just looked at aggression in large pens. So these are relatively large pens, 150 sows per pen, housed at about 20 to 22 square feet. And the first thing we did was just simply look at the lesion scores. So we'd go in, and after you put the group together, they're going to go ahead and establish their social hierarchy, and then sometimes in establishing that social hierarchy, they resort to aggression to work those differences out, and you end up getting scratches, cuts, and other skin lesions from those interactions. And so we have a system where we can go ahead and quantify them, going from 0 to greater than 7. And to be honest, the high end of the scale is about 30. So this is really what you can see, and actually in total is these lesions are not all that large. I mean, there's a large number that have a fairly mild lesion score, and then you've got a small number here that actually have a significant number of lesions. And so we would argue that that perhaps having a large pen like this helps minimize the fighting, or the negative aspects of fighting. And to support that, we then actually went and measured what the subsequent litter size was of those pigs. And what you can see across here is that there's really no negative effect of the lesions. I mean, basically the litter size is constant across these different levels of aggression. So I think we'd suggest here that maybe with enough space to establish a social hierarchy, you can really kind of minimize the negative effects of fighting. So, and so I think I want to kind of follow on that thread and take it to maybe something a little bit more practical. So the way we interpret this is that that pigs prefer to avoid each other rather than fight each other, and they need space to avoid each other, and the behaviors would suggest that space probably needs to be at least 30 or 40 feet. But I think it's intuitive, it makes sense that the bigger the pen, the more animals are involved. If you don't like someone, it's going to be easier to get away from them. And these would be kind of 3 different ways that we're currently housing sows in pens. So we have small pens, usually somewhere between 6 to 12 sows. We're fed on the floor. Then in cases we have what I'll call a big pen, which is kind of 60 to 80 sows. And then we're seeing more and more of what I call really big pens, which might be 200 to 300 sows in a pen. And when I think about this from the animal's perspective, I would suggest that probably it goes from bad to good, or from worse to better when you go from a small pen to a big pen, just because that big pen does a better job of allowing animals to manage aggression as to how they were probably genetically programmed to do that, which would be avoidance. The challenge is if you look at it from the people's perspective, it's probably a heck of a lot easier to manage sows in small groups, okay? You think about it, if you have a lame or a sick animal, it's going to be much easier to find her amongst 10 than it is amongst 300, right? And so the question is, from, to me, is maybe this is what's better for the animal, the big pen, but if we can't offer the same level of care, or we can't do our job as caretakers, are we really going forward? And so where on this spectrum from big to small are we going to end up? And I think we still need to know a little bit more about what a sow wants. And so I think for me, then that's kind of the stepping off point where at some level, I think everybody, particularly the customers, want to know if the pigs are happy, right? And the easiest thing to do would be just be able to ask them, okay? And I've tried, and I never get a satisfactory answer. And I think Candace has probably been trying even longer than I have, right? So what do we do about that? So basically, this is where I'm going to ask you to probably take that step with me, maybe suspend some of your beliefs. And we're going to talk a little bit about human psychology, and if there's anything we can learn from human psychology that might be applied to understanding this question about really, I think what you really want to know is what's the subjective experience of the pig. And so how can we do that? So, and the way we think about this is the classic half empty versus half full glass. So how do you see that glass? And in human psychology, there's a paradigm that's called cognitive or judgment bias. And basically the notion is that your emotional state, okay, shapes how you make decisions, particularly in the face of ambiguous decisions. So this would be an example from what they've done with humans. And so you would first present someone with a relatively ambiguous word, such as bark, and then you ask them to choose a matching word with it. And they would have the choice between tree and dog. In the case for ram, they had the choice between sheep and push. And what the studies have shown is that emotions do affect how people make these choices, and particularly people that either self-report as being anxious or even have been diagnosed as clinically having anxiety disorders are much more likely to associate that ambiguous cue with a threat, okay? So they would choose bark with dog rather than tree, and they're going to choose ram with push rather than sheep, okay? And so the notion in the human literature is that there are people out there who see that glass as half empty, and so when presented with an ambiguous cue, they're going to interpret that in a negative way, okay? And that's shaped not by necessarily their rational thinking, but by their emotional state. And so that's kind of actually, I guess, has spawned a cottage industry here in the animal world, trying to see if we can apply that basic paradigm of judgment of an ambiguous cue to animals to get some insight into what their emotional state is. And that's, if you could anthropomorphize that then to quote unquote whether or not they're happy. And I think often people talk about this as to whether or not one is optimistic or pessimistic. I would be somewhat reluctant to necessarily use those exact words on animals, but that's certainly how they think about it in the people world. And so, but what people have seen with a variety of different species is that in cases where you have animals in an enriched environment versus a barren environment, or in a case where you can give an animal an anxiolytic drug, something like Valium or something like that, that they tend to interpret more often these ambiguous cues as positive. And conversely, when you do things like dehorning calves, and other painful procedures, that they're more likely to go ahead and interpret these ambiguous cues as negative. So supporting the notion that maybe there is some validity to this approach in animals. And so we were curious just to see, so could we try this in sows, okay? are the sows happy? So how do they respond to an ambiguous cue? And the question is, does that tell us something about their affective state or emotional state? And so this is the paradigm that we used, and so I'll step through that and then show you the results. This is work done by Dr. Christina Horbach, another postdoc in our lab. But basically the way you do this, and I figured I better modify this slide for the audience today, we basically start and we have an arena, and we'll let the sow into the arena, and she learns that if the bowl is on the, let's say, left side of the arena, she's allowed to eat from it, so she gets a positive reward. If we put the bowl on the right side of the arena, there's still feed there, but we don't let her eat from the bowl. And so, and I'll show you if the video works here. This is the so-called go trial. So we open the gate and let the sow into the arena, and you see that the bowl is in the left. She assesses the situation and decides to go and eat. And so we do this, and basically they'll reach a criteria. So now this is the other side. So now this is the negative that's on the other side. You can see when she crosses that line, and it might be surprising to you that shaking a red flag in the face of a 500-pound animal is enough to deter them from doing this. But what you can actually see that over a few days of training, she actually learns. So you see she walks up, realizes where the bowl is, and just walks away, okay? So basically that's the training paradigm. So we're trying to get sows to learn positive cue and negative cue, so kind of classic conditioning experiment. And usually 3 to 5 days of training is what we do, and they kind of have to meet a criteria of kind of 10 correct responses without making mistakes. And once they get to that learning curve, then we actually do the real experiment, which is then put the bowl in the middle. Okay, it's not left and it's not right, and we see how they respond. Do they treat it like it's a positive and run right to it? Or do they treat it like it's the negative cue and stand back or approach it slowly? And so that's the experiment, and then we measure the latencies, the time it takes for them to get there, and then put it into a little bit of a scale, and we come up with something we call the cognitive bias index. So basically, if you get a 0 on the index, that means you see it as a negative cue, so you don't approach it at all. And if you get a 1, you would see it as positive, and so you basically go to it as fast as you would approach the positive cue. And I think what was interesting to us is what you can see is that we actually get a varied response, okay? So some sows interpret that ambiguous cue as positive, some as negative, and some are kind of ambivalent about it, actually. Okay, so what does that mean? And I'm not totally sure what it means. A couple of things I don't have time to show you the data for, which I think is interesting, is that we can actually predict the response on this based on behavioral traits. And what's interesting to me is actually behavioral traits that we can identify when they're still on the sow. Okay, so so the way I tend to look at this, I'll remind you that this is the response to a group of sows who are identically housed in pen gestation, and if you take this at face value, you would say that some animals would see that experience as more positive than others. Okay, and so I think to me that's a huge complication. So it suggests that maybe, to me, just simply moving stalls out of gestation stalls isn't the only thing we need to improve sow welfare. So it's much more complicated than that. And I think probably what it tells us is that individual animals are going to have different experiences. And so at some point we probably have to understand better the needs of individual animals. And maybe that's mostly based on hierarchy. So, if you're a dominant sow, maybe it's okay to cruise around the pen, right? If you're a timid sow, maybe you're not so happy because you're always worried about getting beaten up. And so, and again, we're stretching the interpretation of what a positive response and a negative response means on this, okay? But I guess I'm not gonna, I'll let that up to you to decide how to interpret it. I just want to impress upon you the fact that it's different amongst different animals. Okay. So I think I'm going to wind down here and just kind of bring some concluding thoughts back together. So I think, first of all, when we start to think about pen design, the needs for the pigs and the people may differ, so that's certainly a complication. And then when we look at welfare measures, so these kind of affective state measures like what I just showed you for cognitive bias, it may depend more on who you are as a pig rather than where you are. So it may, certainly transcend just issues related to the environment or housing alone. And so I think we really need more research today to identify how sows prioritize their different behavioral needs and recognize that different sows may have different sets of priorities. And such, like I said before, animals at different places in the social hierarchy may see the housing question differently. I think the other thing that I see as more general as challenges related to sow housing, many food companies have aggressive timelines about making these changes, and it's 2016. There's a couple that are actually one. Bon Appetit was 2015. They've just passed it. There's a few more coming up in 2017, and I think you're starting to hear the frustration on that side of the business about the fact that they can't source pork the way they had committed to their customers. Okay, I would argue that probably they were somewhat naive in making some of those commitments because they didn't really understand what it was going to take. And I would suggest that once you scratch the surface, that it's probably even more complicated than we might have thought, okay? And so I think we have a lot more to learn about making the transitions if we really want to end up where the customers started, which was they are worried about the welfare of the pigs. And I think also you have to understand that I think farmers at some level understand, they probably wouldn't use the words that I would use, but I think they understand these transitions are hard. And so I think, in the absence of this knowledge, farmers are going to resist these changes. So I think you have to understand that transition. And so I think, again, we need to probably maybe step back and invest more time and money to try to understand how to make this transition successful for everyone, all stakeholders, whether that's the farmer, the packer, the customer, as well as the pigs. So I think that's what I wanted to say, and I'll take questions. And as we're taking questions, this is the true pig's eye view of animal welfare. So we mounted a GoPro camera on the back of a pig and let her loose in pen gestation, and so you can actually see what she sees as she negotiates. And she's actually just been put in the pen, and so she's kind of sorting through the social complexities of where her place is. And up here, this is my favorite part. You can see this one here is the kind of police sow. She comes up and checks out the new player. Unfortunately, they kind of give each other that hairy eyeball and then decide that it's okay and walk away. And so, it didn't end up escalating to a fight. But in many cases, it does escalate to a fight. So anyways, that's what I had for you today, and I appreciate any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Have any questions for, yes, Dr. Klutzman?
You mentioned that in the ecological studies that sows synchronize their behaviors. Do they also synchronize their ovulatory cycles when they're penned together?
So basically the short answer is no. I mean, I guess in most commercial settings, they never get to the pen until they're bred. Okay, so I mean, in the commercial setting, we're actually usually using weaning. So pigs have, for those that don't know, pigs have a very strong lactational anestrus. So when they're nursing, their ovaries are shut down. And so when they actually are weaned, then that lactational anestrus ceases, and kind of 4 to 7 days later, they come into heat. And the industry uses that very powerfully to synchronize breeding. And most of these pen systems are set up such that they're actually usually transitioned into stalls and bred in stalls and then move into the pens. Now, in the wild, I actually don't know so much about that, but I mean, again, they probably only have 1 litter per year in the wild, where we're pushing 0.4 probably in the in our commercial settings, and I'm guessing that probably reproductive behavior is driven by the availability of resource there. And so in other words, and if someone knows better than I, who's a reproductive physiology, my guess is that there are certain probably nutritional requirements that need to be met for the ovaries to kick in, and that's probably what, and so, there's probably some synchrony in the group. But I think when we talk about social facilitation, I think we're thinking more about daily behaviors such as sleeping and eating and traveling. Thank you.
Just 2 things. First, in the wild, sows that are under strong hunting or eradication pressure will have more litters in the same year. The numbers just keep going up. Those studies are basically funded by, of all people, the Air Force, because having a bunch of wild pigs running around airfields is not good. Question. Okay, let's say we have dominant or more aggressive sows, and we have passive sows, and we have somewhere in the middle sows. Now, if you remove the dominant or aggressive sows, does these domesticated sows assume the wild sow behavior where some of the medium ones or some of the passive ones become dominant? Or do they all stay happy?
No, that's a great question. And there's a bunch of different dimensions. So one of the things we see in commercial farms, so with the electronic sow feeders, the sows go through the feeder more or less every day in the same order. And we interpret that as a proxy for at least some type of social hierarchy. And in many of these, particularly on smaller farms, these pens are so-called dynamic. So actually we're always taking a small number of animals out to go to farrowing and putting new bred animals in. So that social hierarchy is always changing. And certainly that's what we see, is that when animals leave, that someone else definitely fills that bill. I don't think we see that much overt aggression at that point. I think the other thing is interesting related to that is when we put new animals into the pen, so one of these dynamic systems, we probably change 10 to 20% of the constituents every week or two. Most of the aggression is between the newly established animals. I mean, the newly entering animals. So they're establishing their own kind of social hierarchy, and everyone else kind of stays out of the way. And so I think it's, in these large pens, it's probably a bunch of little social hierarchies kind of put together.
Like NFL training camps, the rookies all trying to
Exactly. No, that's exactly right. So I do think there certainly is, they're going to step up and fill that. I mean, I think the other question, what I thought you were going to ask, is what happens if we never put the aggressive animals in? Are we in a better place? And I don't know that we know that, right? So.
I always like hearing you speak. I remember when you spoke at the AMI NAMI conferences, and it's fascinating to listen to you, and once again, you impressed us. You were talking about working with the group housing and having a chance to work with that out in the field, and I guess one of my questions is, I'm a kind of a firm believer that this is the way to go, and I'm wondering if there's any information on like the economics where you can share the economics of the change, whether it's been, can we convince, I'm always trying to convince slaughter plants the economics of doing it the right way. So is there advantages to convince people economically that going this direction helps in the long term?
So, I mean, Roger has a lot of experience at this point as well with that question. I think, so you can look at it a couple different ways. There's the market access issue, which is probably not the answer you wanted, which, if the market's going that way, you can raise any pigs any damn way you want, but if you don't have a place to sell them, that's not a very good business model, right? But that's not a very good way to convince people to change, right? I mean, people don't like change under that. I think our experience has been is that, particularly with the electronic sow feeding system, so I mean that's the other thing that often gets lost in the discussion, is that from my perspective, implementing electronic sow feeding versus implementing the small floor system, feed system, small pens, is almost as different as they are from crates themselves, right? So I mean, I think we get in trouble if we paint with too broad of brushes, and so that's another discussion point. Is small pen gestation is one animal and big pen gestation is another animal, and I think my job as an advisor is try to help identify which farms should do which and which should do the other, right? I mean, there's definitely attributes that are going to make one system work better than the other, and if the farm has that capacity, then they should capture it. I think what we've seen with electronic sow feeding is that we have farms that are doing as well or better than what they did in crated barns, okay? Now, to me, where the real economic risk is the transition. So some farms learn how to use that system pretty quickly, and I think Roger would attest to it. He still probably has farms that are still trying to figure it out, right? And so that's where the economic loss is that if you can't figure it out, or it takes you a long time to figure it out and you're running at suboptimal production, that's a cost, right? And I think maybe that's where, as an industry, we need to do better, is trying to understand how to get people through that transition. And maybe some people we shouldn't ask to make that transition. I mean, but I think, we certainly have farms that are doing as well or better, but I don't know that, I think I would be hard pressed to make a real strong case that it's an economic panacea. Right. I mean, I think the way I would look at it, this is what the market's going to expect, and I think we can do it. But it's hard for me to say that, you're going to get $10 more a pig because you're going to be that much more efficient. I mean, we do know, certainly feed utilization in the ESP system seems to be better than it is in a crated barn. But again, that, with $7 corn, that's a much bigger deal than it is with $3.50 corn now. So I don't know, Roger, do you have, I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I mean, do you have any, anything you want to share on that front?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, there's a lot of challenges around capital, expenditures, more square footage, all that type of stuff. But the biggest part's what you're saying is learning to use these systems. It's not the same as what we've typically done. So there is a learning curve, and we're still learning what systems work best with what management style.
Yeah, so. I mean, I'd say the change isn't hard, it's different, but if change is hard for you, then it's going to be hard. Yeah,
Well, one thing just to clarify, which you made that differentiation, you're asking about operating efficiencies, not capital investment. And for a Tyson or a Smithfield who has available capital every year to make an investment is a very different scenario than a small, medium producer who has to go to the bank with a potential non-existent return on investment in this scenario. So
yeah, and
that's a very, very real issue if you ask any of the ag lenders.
And I think part of the idea was, at least by some of these companies, of giving, like McDonald's picking 2022, that the hope would be that you would wait until the facility was depreciated before when you're ready to recapitalize, you just recapitalize in a different way. It's a whole different animal if you're forced. If you're forced. I think the other thing that Colette brings up, which I think is interesting, is again, most of the people that would want to see this sow housing change, I think they would feel better that they were going to get their pork from small independent or medium-sized farmers, and don't recognize that this change is probably going to drive some of those people out of the business because of lack of capital, right? Yeah.
Okay. You're trying really to improve living conditions for, let's say, sows or animals. What about those organizations like PETA, who continuously fight, so to speak, for animal rights? Do they like your research? Do they support it? Do they praise it? Do they tell the public about what you're doing? Maybe even do they finance it?
so you have to close the doors. No, so
Facetious.
no. I mean, it's a very good question, and actually, one of the things that we've tried to do, which I think is unique, being in Pennsylvania, we're not really in this, central Midwest area, so we're a little bit out of the main hog production area, maybe a little bit off the radar screen, and also I would argue that, where I live in Pennsylvania, I believe it's an 8-hour drive to half the population in the country, right? And so some of these customer societal issues are more in our face. So we've tried to position ourselves actually as a nexus between animal industry and animal advocacy, okay? So we've reached out, and actually the renovations to this facility, which we did 5 years ago, well, it's 8 years ago now, which really allowed us to do research, was funded by the American ASPCA, okay? So we certainly have gotten funding from those groups. Now, what I'd go on to say is that 2 points. One is it's been a very tenuous relationship, okay? Because there's an awful lot of their constituencies that don't like the idea that I know Roger, okay, basically, right? I mean, that we're so much involved with the industry, so that creates problems for them. The flip side of it is, there's animal agriculture groups that are real nervous that I talk to some of these groups and even get money from some of these groups. The other thing you got to understand is that ASPCA is not PETA, right? I mean, there is a spectrum there, okay? And then I think the thing when I talk to these animal advocacy groups that I always say to them, though, I think my biggest challenge is if you look at what you do, it's hard for me to stand in front of a group of producers and say that you really are worried about animal advocacy and animal welfare, and you're not pushing a vegetarian agenda. Right, so when I get HSUS in the room, they have this Meatless Monday campaign, right? So, okay, and so, I say, what's that got to do with animal welfare, right? And so, of course, they would then say that, well, if we use less animals, we're going to have less animal suffering, and so then the world is a better place, and maybe people would just pay more money for pork, and so farmers would be okay, right? But of course, they don't understand that we're working in a global environment. And so from my perspective, if we improve animal welfare and reduce the number of pigs we produce in this country, it creates a human ethical dilemma because we're really just simply taking food out of somebody else's mouth somewhere in the world, right? And so it's a very myopic view. So sometimes I like what I do. And then, I've actually been very critical of HSUS about saying that Sow Housing is too simplistic. In other words, they've kind of portrayed it as whether or not the sow can turn around, and that's been a great soundbite, and it's been a very effective campaign. I think our work, I think anybody else's experience that works in the swine industry would understand that that's it's much more complicated, and so they're not as friendly as they used to be to me since I've said that. And so I don't know, but I think it's important to have those dialogues, but I think at some level, I think maybe you're asking what's their real agenda, and that's unclear. I would approach it with a great degree of skepticism, I guess is what I would say. And I just also want to say American Humane is different as well, so no.
This is one really quick one, and maybe somebody in the room, if not you, knows the answer. Because everybody's pushing for the sow housing, for non-gestation stalls, are they paying more for that?
That's another good question. Yeah. So there's clear niche markets, okay, but that would be bigger changes than what we're kind of talking about here, right? Yeah, okay. In some cases, some packers have been paying a small premium to meat for animals, and that I think everyone's expectation is that that premium will probably go away at some point. It's not large now. It will probably go away at some point. To me, you take a company like Oscar Mayer, who has come out and said that they want to ban gestation stalls from their supply, right? who does Oscar Mayer, Oscar Mayer sells lunch meat that goes in kids' lunches to go to school, right? It's not, yuppies or high-end people, right? They're buying. So you ask them, does your customer care about this, right? And two, does your economic model allow you to pay more to get crate-free pork? And they're very forthright to say no, that they can't afford to pay more. But I think what's telling is they say, so the question about does your customer care, and they say no, but our job is to make sure that they never do. And so they're looking at this in I think a very different way than the industry looks at it, right? I mean, they're worried often about the kids who are actually in high school now and what they're going to think when they become a customer. So they just have a much more longer term view. And I think that's part of the dissonance that we hear, because the pork board will go out and do focus groups and comes back that 70% of people don't even know what a gestation stall is, right? So that's confusing to the farmers because they're getting pushed in this direction, right? But the people that are pushing them, and if anybody's here from that sector that wants to, this is my interpretation, and if anyone wants to counter me or support me, they can say that. But I think they just have a much longer vision for their business plan, and they're worried about, what their customer is going to look like in 10 years, and how do they have to have their supply chain to look like that. So there we go. Okay, very good.
I want to ask the audience a question, because I was sitting here thinking while you were answering that question. I've seen beef labeled grass-fed with special care. I've seen chicken labeled in every way you can think of. I haven't seen so much in turkey, but I've seen a little bit of that kind of niche market labeling in turkey. I haven't seen any in pork. Has anybody else seen any in the state of Arkansas or around where they have those kind of claims, gestation stall free, and nobody?
Yeah, they exist.
Interesting.
Yeah, they don't say gestation stall free, so they make the worst possible thing you can put on a label.
I don't even see that.
Like, reared in a humane fashion.
But I haven't seen
I
that.
have several examples.
Yeah, but I mean, just thinking about the local markets. Have you seen something, Tony?
Yeah, your colleague here is exactly right. Because I can't move very well, I go to the Ozark Natural Food Store, because the store is smaller and I can wheel the carts through without getting collapsing. And you do see labels and advertising, point of sale advertising, that's saying raised humanely. Now, we don't know. Nobody really knows. That means that what? They're not whipping the pigs. But then the other catch is raised sustainably. What does that mean? But caring manner or a humane manner, that's what you're getting, I guess. Their phrasing is like that. They're vague and they don't know. But the audience for them, as our speaker said, places like that are not like serving. They always will make a deal about supporting the subsistence farmer, the local subsistence farmer. That's where people park their Volvos and go in, and pay twice as much or 3 times as much, and then come out.
Well,
But yes, that's the kind of label you do.
I'm talking about the Walmart, the Harps locally, because that's where I shop. I don't go in the high-end stores, so yeah, for me, but yes, they're full of them. One quick comment, Shauna, and then time for a break.
Well, more of a question. So you have this cognitive bias, and say you have all the resources in the world and you can do it pre-weaning and see who wants what. Would it make sense to put some stalls without doors on them so they have the options to go in? Is that feasible? Because from my understanding, cage-free at the moment means open door. So it could still be gestation stall free if they allow them access out.
Yeah, so that's a good question. We certainly have producers that are thinking about it in that way. The problem, if you leave the doors off, then it creates the ultimate place to be beat up.
Could you train them to push it?
Well, so that, I mean, there are the so-called free access. So there is a type of housing called free access stalls or self-catching crates where they go in and out and they can control that. The problem is that takes about 50% more square footage than what, but certainly we see farms, including some farms in this room, where they do put a small number of crates in the pen, and then if they think they have animals that are not thriving, they can put them into the so-called TLC area. So that's, that's one approach. I guess I'm a, what do I want to say, an optimist or a dreamer in that, I would like to see if we can fix it, right, rather than have a crutch. But it may be that, there's some, I look at it, there's maybe just, the other thing I didn't explicitly say here is that for 35 years we've been selecting sows to perform in stalls, right? And so just to open the stall door and ask them to walk out into a pen, that may not be the right animal. And so part of what we have to do is identify who's that right animal. And I think we never looked very hard at behavioral traits when we're doing selection, and that's what we need to do more of. And there's probably, there's technology out there that may, in terms of genetic technology, if we actually know the phenotype, then it might actually be able to go fairly quickly. But we've got to get those behavioral phenotypes nailed down a little better before we can do things like that. So,
Thank you, Tom. That's good.